collect the Sunday school offering. Well, good morning. What a beautiful day it is outside. But then again, every day we get an opportunity to be in the house of the Lord. We finished up our series talking about what we believe and why we believe it. Basically, back to basics is what we do. And through that, we learned that by looking at our own human body, we know that God exists. The fact that we're so complex that we have a capacity to reason, the fact that when we look at a human body, the composition itself is so unique and intrinsic, that it's so detailed that even we don't even fully understand how our own body works. Even science doesn't know how our own body fully functions. We know that by looking at nature, it proves that there is a God. Just the fact that everyone has an idea that God exists, proves that there is a God. We didn't create this idea of somebody being greater, because if it was left up to man, we would create ourselves and place ourselves in that. And I don't mean physically create, but we would place ourselves in that high level of supremacy. We would place and set ourselves up as king and rulers over everything. How can we confirm that? Well, humanism. Look at the world around us. Evolution and everything else promotes man. But when you get down to it, God is above all things. We studied and compared several different versions of the Bible to see, A, if the Bible is fully the Word of God, and B, which Bible is the correct Bible that we should be using. And of course, we came down to the fact that the King James is still the closest translation we have today. We're going to be diving into a whole new topic in a brand new series. And we're going to be investigating and looking at, in detail, the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm not going to talk about that too much now because we'll have plenty of time in the future. But before we go any farther, did anybody memorize their memory verse from last week? If not, our memory verse from this week will be found in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew 5. And verse 13. Matthew 5:13. No, I didn't say that right. Yeah, Matthew 5:13. If someone wants to go ahead and read that, please. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 15.
Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but oil, and give light unto all that are in the house.
Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Today we're just going to do introductory to all four Gospels before we start diving into the series itself. I handed out a little chart. I placed a chart back there comparing the four Gospels. And we'll be looking at that today. There's also a set of notes dealing with an introduction. It started, I printed out the top of the way, so it got a little blurred, but it's pages 1 and 2. And you'll see it has authors, and so it has authors on the front of it as a main point. But as we begin looking at the four Gospels, let's talk, before we start looking at the Sermon on the Mount, let's get a better understanding of the four Gospels and the role that they play in Scripture and how they relate. When we look at the four Gospels, how many exist? There's four. There's four Gospels. Does anybody want to name them? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are 4 Gospels. But there are 3 that are called synoptic. Basically, they cover several of the same areas. They interlock, they interrelate. By studying these 3 in detail, they give us a better understanding of what's going on. What do I mean by synoptic? Basically, they're presenting the same view of Christ. So looking at him from maybe not, and I realize there are different people, they're going to look at it, different things, but they're going to be focusing on like his miracles. They're going to be focusing on his actions. Synoptic can be described as this way, in this way: seeing eye to eye, or seeing with one eye. By putting all 3 together, they're giving us a better, clearer picture of several of the events contained within those books. But then John, he stands out. He realizes what he's writing. He's probably the last one to write his gospel, and he writes it from an entirely different angle. It's interesting. When we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all those gospels, they focus, Brother Eli, on the miracles of Christ. They will focus on his teachings. They'll focus on his actions. Of course, they'll focus on his birth. They'll focus on stories involving Christ. And I should say stories, but accounts concerning Christ. But when we look at the Gospel of John, he's not so much concerned, Sister Janet, about him feeding the 5 fish, feeding that 5,000 with the 2 loaves and 5 fishes. He's not concerned with the 4 brothers carrying the man down to lower him through the roof, but rather John stands back and focuses on the words of Christ. Whereas the other ones may have focused on his actions, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John focuses and hones in on the words of Christ. Now we're just going to step back and break it down a little bit farther. How do we know that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the actual authors? How do we know that it's reliable to trust in the fact that they wrote them? Well, let's look at Matthew. For this, we're going to go back into history. And the names I'm going to be reading off are going to be what we consider the early church founders. Some of them, Sister Jane, you might even recognize from Catholic Church, or maybe things being tossed around. We probably, some of us may have heard of St. Jerome, or Jerome. He's the one that wrote the Latin Vulgate for the Catholic Church. He's the one that wrote that version of the Bible. But at the same time, we're looking back in history and saying, do these men adhere to the fact that these 4 people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do they confirm that they wrote the Gospels? And if you recall from our Easter sessions the last 2 years, they do. If we go back to looking at the book of Matthew, if we go back around 130 AD, which would be roughly 100 years after Christ died on the cross, Papias confirmed and declared that Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. About not even maybe 25 years later, Apollinarius of Hierapolis confirmed that Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. Around 185 and 254 AD, going a little bit farther into the future and coming a little bit closer towards our time frame, Irenaeus and Origen confirmed that Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. And then there's a famous name in there, Eusebius, 260 through 340 AD, roughly in that time frame, confirmed that Matthew was truly the author of the book of Matthew. Why is this important? Well, it's important for several reasons. We need to know what we believe and why we believe it. It doesn't hurt to find out a little bit more information. But also, when you're looking at the resurrection of Christ, which is the key focal point in Christianity, every other religion, their founding fathers, or their founding father, or the founder has passed away. Christianity is the only one whose leader, Jesus Christ, founder, truly resurrected. Now, I say that with a grain of salt because the Buddhists believe that Buddha resurrected. But that wasn't until 600 years after he already died. But regardless, when you look down to it, everyone cannot deny the fact of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record the crucifixion and death of Christ. And if either of them can be proven wrong or false, there goes the whole life of Jesus Christ, all his miracles and his resurrection. Now I'm going to go a little bit farther. Can anyone tell me who wrote the book of Mark? Mark did, but we're going to dive into a little bit more detail. Was Mark a disciple of Jesus Christ? And when I say that, one of the original 12? No. So, who is Mark? This man writes a gospel, and we're not even quite sure of his background.
He was trying to do it, disciples of Christ, but not one of himself.
Oh, I totally agree with you, brother. I'm going somewhere with this. I'm just picking at, because these are things that we know. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We are taught this all growing up. But who did them? Do you remember a boy who went on a missionary trip with Barnabas and Paul?
John Mark.
John Mark. John Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, wrote the book of John. Wrote the book of Mark. In fact, how do we know he was the cousin of Jesus? I have all messed up today. Ignore me. I step back. Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10 shows that he was Barnabas' cousin. If someone would like to read Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10, please. And that's where we get the fact that John Mark was Barnabas' cousin. Moving on a little bit farther, how do we know that Mark was truly the author of the book of Mark? Well, I'll speed up this one a little bit more. Irenaeus, right around 130 to 202 AD, confirmed that John Mark was the author of Mark. Around 150 to 215 AD, Clement of Alexandria confirmed that John Mark was the author of the book of Mark. Tertullian, right around 160 to 220 AD. Origen, right around 185 to 254 AD. And Jerome, right around 347 to 420 AD. So right around 400 years after the death of Christ, people are still saying that John Mark was the author of the Gospel of Mark. Now moving on to another book. We've covered Matthew, Mark. What about Luke? Who was Luke?
Physician.
He was a physician. Was he one of the original 12?
No.
No. Was he even a Jew? Luke is the only Gentile author in the entire Bible. All the other books were written by Jews. with the exception of Luke and Acts. Luke was the author of both those books. He was a Gentile physician who was there with the ministry of Paul. It's believed that he was actually Paul's personal physician. There in Lystra, Paul was stoned, and it's believed that there is where he had the vision where he was caught up, and this is for those who believe that Paul was the man he was talking about, who was caught up to the third heaven. It's believed that either he died or he got close to dying there. It's also believed that it was at Lystra from the stoning that he received his bad eyesight. Because I think it was Corinthians, he told them, see how large of a letter I write unto you. It wasn't length, but he had to write really big. His eyes were bad. So Luke was a Gentile. He was not there. In the same way with John Mark, both of them probably received the information concerning the life of Christ either by watching him personally, following his ministry, or B, they received it from Paul. Paul was there the whole time. He was part of the Sanhedrin. He was also the one that had Stephen stoned. We find there in the book of Acts, I think it's chapter 6. They laid Stephen's coat down at the feet of Saul. How do we know that Luke was the author of the Gospel of Luke? First of all, around 100 AD to 165, Marcion declared that Luke was the author of the Gospel of Luke. Once again, Irenaeus, the same person who confirmed that Matthew and Mark were written by the original people, also confirmed that Luke was the author of it. Clement of Alexandria around 150 to 215 AD. Origen around 185 to 254 AD. And if that's not good enough, there is a list of books that were considered the inspired books of the Bible, and it is listed among them right around 170 AD. Now finally we come to our fourth and final gospel, which is the book of John. Who wrote the book of John? John. John the Beloved. One of the 12 disciples. Probably the one that was closest to Christ, because at the Passover, he leaned on the chest of Christ. Well, how do we know that he was the author of the book of John? Well, we're going to speed things up again. Once again, we find our good friend Irenaeus there, from around 130 to 202 AD. We find Clement of Alexandria, around 150 to 215 AD. We find Tertullian, right around 160 to 220. Origen joins the list again. Eusebius is on there as well. And once again, the man who wrote the Latin Vulgate for the Catholic Church, Jerome, is there as well. So when we look at the four Gospels, 2 were written by one of the 12, and 2 were written by other people. Now we're going to dive a little bit deeper talking about the books. Whenever we begin studying the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in any book, they always come up with 4 symbols. The lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle. When we look at Matthew, they always symbolize Matthew with the lion. Can anyone tell me what's important about the lion? What is the lion when it comes to the jungle? He's the king of the jungle. He's the ruler of the jungle. He rules in majesty. I mean, there's just something when you look at a male lion with that big old mane, it declares dominance. When we look at the book of Matthew and the way that he portrayed Jesus Christ, he didn't portray him as a lowly babe in the manger and kept him there. He didn't show him as some weakling, but rather he showed him as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the one who is triumphant the one who's majestic, the one who puts all other kings and kingdoms underfoot. He shows that what God was talking about when he declared that he is the one that sets up kings and kingdoms, and he is the one that tears them down. When we look at Matthew, we get that image taken from Daniel of the stone cut out of the mountain without hands, that comes down and breaks the statue, which represents those kingdoms of the past. Babylon, the great empire. Media Persia, the great kingdom of Alexander the Great. And then the ones who extended it above all, the Romans. But yet this stone, without hands, just comes rolling down the mountainside and crushes all these kingdoms into dust. That is the image of Jesus Christ that Matthew gives to us. He is the King of Kings, and he is the Lord of Lords. When we look at Mark looked at Jesus Christ, and he's associated with the image of the ox. It is one who is a worker, one who is a servant to the master, so to speak. He would be that one that we can consider the trailblazer. He goes out where there isn't a path, and he cuts a path. He takes the burden of the world upon himself. He takes the burden of sin upon himself. And he tracks through the deep mud, doing whatever he has to produce the finished product. He is the one who is strapped upon with that harness that pulls the plow behind him, preparing the soil. That is the image of Jesus Christ that Mark presented. He doesn't show him necessarily as the King of Kings or the Lord of Lords. He doesn't take away from it. But the image he gives of Christ to us is that suffering servant from Isaiah chapter 56, I believe it is. He is the one who does whatever it takes to produce the finished product. When we look at the life of Christ, we see that shown through every aspect. And there's no clear way to see that. I should say there's no clear picture of that than Jesus Christ hanging on the cross. Even when he's hanging and dying, he's willing to take upon the sins of the world upon his shoulders. When he's hanging and dying, he's caring for the soul next to him. This day shall you be with me in paradise. He is there speaking down from the cross to his mother and to the beloved disciple John, saying, you know what, I'm going away. While my mother was in my possession, since my earthly father passed away, John, now I would need you to take care of her. Mother, don't worry about your needs. He will be the one to take care of you now. And when we look at the cross, the only scream we find of Christ relating to himself is the one, Eli, Eli, Shabbathani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? All other signs point to caring for the needs of others. When we look at the life of Christ, he said, birds have nests, but there's not even a pillow for my own head. He's willing to do whatever it takes for us. And that's is what Mark was portraying. He didn't want to just show him as the King of Kings, but he wanted to show him as a suffering servant. He wanted to show him as our high priest, the one who grants all our needs, the one that isn't touched, the one who is touched with the feelings of our infirmity, the one that feels our emotions. And he does whatever he can to answer those needs. When we look at Luke, and it's believed that here his physician side kind of comes out to a degree, but he's represented by the man. Not a cop, but he's represented by the image of a man. Luke portrays him in his humanity. He shows, we want to say, the softer side of God. He shows him and his trials and his agonies, the same thing that we go through on a daily basis. He writes from that aspect, revealing to us that Christ endured like we did. He was in every way tempted as we were. Back in the garden, Adam and Eve were tempted by three big things: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. When Jesus is baptized, immediately following, he's led in the Spirit into the wilderness. And what three big things is he tested with? The lust of the eye, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. Luke shows us his humanity. He's 100% man, which is exactly what the ultimate sacrifice had to be to take away the sins of the world. But then John, he's represented by an eagle. And when we look at an eagle, the lion is the king of the jungle. He rules with majesty. But just as the lion is the king of the jungle, the eagle is the king of the air. He soars above all others. There's none to be his equal. He soars with majesty. The sight of an eagle flying can take your breath away. He rules from on high. He does not make his bed on the ground, nor does he normally nest in trees. But he will find a high position in the cleft of a rock, and there he'll build his nest, high above everything else. When we look at John, not only do we see him as the only one, I take that back, not only do we see him as the apostle who probably represented and revealed the love of Christ more than any other, but when he writes of Jesus Christ, he does not go back to Joseph and Mary for the beginning. He does not trace the lineage of Jesus Christ back to David or Abraham. But rather he goes all the way back past that 500 years of silence, back past Noah, back past Methuselah, back past Abraham, back past Adam and Eve, and he states, in the beginning was the Word. John reveals Jesus Christ as the King of heaven. He shows that he is 100% God. While Luke showed he was 100% man. Two things that are necessity for the ultimate sacrifice. Why did he have to be 100% man? Because he had to be just like you and I. He had to be tempted just like Adam was tempted. He had to know what we go through, our pains, our sorrows. And I'm not saying he didn't know them. But everyone under my voice right now realizes there's a difference between knowing something and experiencing it. Those are two completely different things. And Christ had to experience humanity for himself. But if he would have came through the lineage of Adam, if Joseph would have had any role in bringing about the Messiah, the blood would have been tainted, because all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. It's inherited. But to be free of all sin, God himself had to produce the child. And he came down, and the Holy Ghost moved upon Mary. And for the first time in all of creation, for the first time in the written history of the universe, for the first time in the oral history of everything before there was evidence.